Hi, I'm Jacob HeiIbrunn, the editor of The National Interest, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce a debate and conversation between Dimitri K. Symes, President and CEO of the Center for the National Interest, and Ambassador John Herbst, who directs the Eurasia Center. My co-moderator today is Melinda Haring, who's Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and the author of a recent prominent piece in Foreign Affairs on Ukraine's future. I will begin by asking Dimitri to address the topic of our colloquy today, which is the United States wittingly or unwittingly creating an anti-American coalition abroad? Dimitri, please take it away.
In my mind, the answer is very clear. The United States is contributing to a creation of anti-American coalition. The United States is making very clear that in contrast to the Trump period, we want today to have a very internationalist-oriented foreign policy, that we want to conduct policy in real coordination with our democratic allies, and we suggest that there are dividing lines between democracies and autocracies. We are not saying that the Russians, the Chinese, some others do things in terms of foreign policy which challenge American interests, which are dangerous to American alliances, and accordingly we have to respond. That would be a part of traditional geopolitics. But the Biden administration goes beyond that. The Biden administration is saying that we are doing what we're doing because we need to confront global autocracies. And moreover, the Biden administration is creating an impression that is not only how these autocracies handle their foreign policy, it is how they govern themselves that should be addressed by the United States. And it's very natural that the countries which are being portrayed as autocracies, that they, to put it mildly, don't like it, that some of them are not very secure, not very stable, and then they feel that they're being threatened. And when the United States talks, because of America's enormous power and remaining enormous prestige, they take it seriously. They don't assume, well, they will make some pro-democracy noises in Washington, and this is the end of it. They assume that actions very likely will follow words, and these actions may have real applications for their countries, or particularly for stability of their governments and their elites. And surprise, surprise, when being challenged, those elites want to defend themselves. Very often in the United States and in the European Union, we hear that we live in a period which resembles the period before World War II, and that we really need to confront the dictatorships, because otherwise they would be emboldened and would do really very dangerous things, including very dangerous to the United States. Critics of this point of view, considering themselves realists, they often say, well, actually the period today resembles more the period before World War I, when there was a kind of a formation of two alliances. And each of them obviously had its own narrative of what was happening in the world, and they wanted to defend their interests accordingly. I am actually thinking about more ancient history, about the period when the Athenians were creating their alliance, were very vocal in explaining that they were inviting democracies, but in practice, very often were inviting countries which were not quite democracies and were not on the path to democracy, but just wanted to be friendly with the Athenians and were prepared to walk in lockstep with their foreign policy. And quite a few small states, Greek states at that time, which actually, in terms of their political governance, would be closer to the democratic Athenians than to autocratic Sparta, they did not like that approach. They thought that it was challenging their sovereignty, that it was heavy-handed, and surprise, surprise, the countries, the states which were nominally democratic, they were going and supporting the Spartans. And there was a creation of two coalitions. And today I see a coalition being created, which obviously is built around China and Russia. This is not quite an alliance, at least it's definitely not a formal alliance. And there are limits in the long run how well these countries with very different traditions and interests can work together. But in the short run, they clearly are trying to have synergy in their foreign policies. They do feel that it is in their vital national interest to resist the United States, to confront the United States, and they begin to look at international politics through zero-sum prism to an extent which probably would be natural to them if we were kind of leaving them alone. And then, of course, there are countries like Belarus. Let me be delicate in describing their regime. It's a kind of despicable. And I don't know what I can say that would be really positive about them, with one very notable exception. They wanted to be friendly to the United States. They wanted to be on the right side of the European Union. The president, Alexander Lukashenko, was challenging the Russians on a regular basis, was emphasizing that he was his own man, that he would pursue very often a foreign policy closer to the West than to Russia. And then he had very undemocratic elections. And there was a brutal crackdown when the opposition went to the streets. But basically, he was doing things inside his own country. And these were terrible things, but not quite a genocide. It was a brutal political oppression, which we have seen in many countries, sometimes really allied with the United States, and I can give multiple examples. And we decided, together with the European Union, to ostracize Belarus. And now Belarus is firmly in the Russian corner. Wouldn't want to predict for how long, because it partly depends upon the United States and the European Union. And the modicum of flexibility on our part, I think, can make Belarus less interested in being so much in the Russian pocket. But at this point, we're getting, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, a situation when Russian troops are being invited to Belarus, when President Lukashenko is asking for Russian S-400 anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems, and even more ominously, in my view, is talking about getting Russian nuclear weapons. If you look at the military training and military maneuvers conducted jointly but by Russia and Belarus, it's pretty clear that while they're obviously talking about regular military maneuvers, the nature of these maneuvers clearly suggests that they may have an offensive edge, a possibility of not just defensive, but also offensive operation. And for the first time, Belarusian troops are being part of these exercises together with the Russians, training for joint military action against whom? Clearly, against NATO. So I don't think that so far we have seen anything irreversible. I don't expect a major military confrontation in January or February. At least that's not what I think Putin is thinking about. But we clearly, by our emphasis on dividing the world along the lines of democracy and autocracy were pushing a lot of important and less important nations together, and they have a common platform containing the United States and the European Union.
John, I would welcome your remarks now.
Okay, Jacob, thank you very much. And Dimitri, thank you. You may be surprised, I agree with a fair amount of what you say, but let me frame this a bit differently. All right. The United States has been the principal world power since at least the end of World War II. And that's a result, first and foremost, of us having extraordinary military preeminence at that time, extraordinary economic preeminence, but also because we believed in a certain value set, which was very attractive, certainly to the major nations of Europe, but also critical nations around the world. And a combination of our power and our values enabled us to bring into, you might say, our community of nations, those, the democratic world, our former enemies, principally, of course, Germany and Japan. And our values were an important, but of course not the only part of our strength. That was true in 1946. It's true today, despite all the ups and downs of our foreign policy and of our history. That's the first big point. The second big point, American foreign policy, going back to George Washington's time, was always a combination of American interests and American values. And you saw that play out, for example, in policy towards France during the French Revolutionary period in the 1790s. And you've seen that play out down to this very day. And even while we invariably, well, most of the time, pursue our interests, our values are a factor which in times compounds the effectiveness of our pursuit of our interests, at times kind of gets in the way. And I think Dimitri gave a possible example regarding Belarus. And I could give an example from my time as ambassador in Uzbekistan after the September 11 terrorist attack. Because we needed a base in Uzbekistan to carry the war to the Taliban. But I remember telling the Uzbeks, as I was trying to persuade them to allow us to establish a base, that we're going to be your friends for the next 6 or 8 months, without doubt. But if you want to have a long-term relationship with us, you're going to have to make some changes, especially in your human rights practices, because our values are going to be there and part of the conversation. So this very much frames our foreign policy. The way our values and our interests operate in tandem, and at times not quite in tandem. Now let's talk about what's going on today, because the point of departure for our conversation was the Summit of Democracy. Now, I personally welcomed that summit. I think it plays upon our strengths, or one of our strengths, which is that if you look at the majority of stable, strong, and economically advanced societies, they are democratic. And they are naturally working in sync with us. That's an advantage which China does not have and which Russia does not have. And reminding our principal strong friends, but also our friends globally, those who are part of the democratic world, those who are heading towards the democratic world, reminding them of this and seeking some form of, some platform where we can pursue our similar, if not identical interests, enhances our strength. It's not just a matter of values, it's a matter of interests. I see 2 fingers. That means I have 2 minutes left? Oh, okay, I'm almost done. So to me, this is a no-brainer. And since the subject of our conversation is, are we creating enemies, or are we isolating people to our nations to our disadvantage? My answer is an emphatic no. Look, when the Cold War ended, we reached out to Moscow in a whole host of ways. And I was working on these issues. I was working on Eurasia in the mid-90s. And we agreed on most things with Yeltsin's Russia. with the exception of its treatment of its neighbors in the near abroad. We set up the dialogue with NATO, the Council, the Russia-NATO Council. We did many things to reach out to the Kremlin, but we were not willing, and this again is consistent with our values, but I think also with interests, to let Moscow dominate its neighbors, which of course is also not consistent with critical international documents like the Helsinki Accords and the Paris Charter, which Moscow itself signed. And as for China, China would not be in the WTO were it not for the strong support, but perhaps misguided support of the Clinton administration and then the Bush II administration. China and Russia have created the challenge to the security structure that evolved first after World War II, but then after the Cold War ended. And the Summit of Democracies is us playing the quote unquote value card in response to their challenge. And to me, again, that's both good in terms of our values, but smart in terms of our interests. Last point. We can sometimes overdo this democracy thing. Our policy in the greater Middle East since 9/11 has largely been a disaster because we thought there were certain nations that could become democracies, which were not going to become democracies within my lifetime, and perhaps even the lifetime of my talented deputy director. And so that was a serious mistake. It was a utopian mission, which was also destabilizing. And I think you might be able to make the case that even our approach towards Belarus is not as nuanced as it should be. Okay. But on balance, we have gotten the maintenance of our interests and our values right, on balance, not at all times. And we can certainly do better. And I have not been shy to point out when I think whatever your administration is in power, they can do better. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Melinda, as my co-moderator, is going to pose the first question to Dimitri, I believe.
Wonderful. Jacob, should we do one to Jacob, one to John, one to Dimitri, one to John?
Yeah, just go ahead.
Super. Okay. Dimitri, thank you so much for those eloquent opening remarks. I have a question for you. The Russian ambassador to the US and the Chinese ambassador to the US recently wrote a piece in the National Interest that garnered much attention, and it claimed that both are functioning democracies in their own right. But sir, isn't it ironic that they claim to be democracies when Russian and Chinese propaganda heaps scorn on Western democracy as a source of chaos and instability?
Well, I mean, as you know, this article was published in the National Interest. And I know how it was published. We were approached by the Russian Foreign Ministry. We were offered this article, which Jacob and I thought was pretty unique because it was the first time, to the best of our knowledge, when the Russian ambassador, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, spoke with one voice on an important foreign policy issue and were so blatantly opposed to American foreign policy. We did not edit that article. If we did, I don't know what Jacob would do. It is his prerogative, not mine as a publisher. But if I was asked my opinion, I would certainly suggest to drop the part of the article which you just have mentioned. That great praise of Chinese and Russian democracies. Not only I disagree with what was said by the two ambassadors substantively, I think they have done a disservice to the effectiveness of their own article. And speaking more generally, the Russians, the Chinese, many others who happen to be our opponents today, they do a lot of things which we find disagreeable, which I personally find disagreeable, and I think we have to take them into account. Back in late 1990s, I was one of few American-Russian analysts who was in favor of NATO enlargement, because I thought it was in accordance with our values. And even if I did not see a threat at that time from Russia to, let's say, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, I thought that we, the West, owed them a place in our security community. I was against inviting Russia to join the G7. And I wrote about that in my book at the time, precisely because I thought that Russian domestic practices and values did not make that country appropriate for G7, which at that time was a club of democracies. So it's not a question of having a cynical policy strictly based on American interests or having a policy which would be dominated by American values. Clearly, there has to be a combination of the two, and a policy which is based strictly on foreign policy realism, as the master of realism, Henry Kissinger, observed himself, a policy which would ignore values, would not be supported by the American people. But there is too much of a good thing. It's important to know where to stop. It's one thing for the United States to act as a shining beacon and to make clear that we offer a moral example to the mankind. It's another thing to say that we would protect other democracies when they are subjected to an unprovoked aggression, particularly because they happen to be democracies. It's another thing to declare almost half of the mankind, perhaps more, being on the other side of our great dividing line between democracy and autocracy. A, it is not quite that simple. And second, I firmly believe it is contrary to American interests if we really want to have an effective foreign policy, and as John said, as we want to maximize American enormous advantages, is being a number one country in the world. The policy which overreaches, the policy which cannot be supported not just by the Chinese and the Russians, but even the Indians, the greatest democracy in the world, such a policy is not helping to isolate China and Russia. Such a policy, in my view, makes America vulnerable.
John, I would like to pose a question to you that relates to what Dimitri said and builds on your own remarks about the Biden summit on behalf of democracies. I understand what Biden was trying to achieve, but was it in fact little more than an anti-Trump feel-good exercise? According to Freedom House, about a third of the countries that were invited don't qualify as democracies. And you had a lot of disputation surrounding the issue of what is the condition of American democracy itself. Shouldn't America be focused on fixing its own domestic debilities before it engages in some kind of new democratic crusade? What's your response?
All right. One, this was principally or largely a convoking of democracies. Yes, there were some nations there, and not necessarily a small number, but still a clear minority, who on the Freedom House scale are considered partly free. As far as I know, there was no one there who's on the Freedom House scale considered authoritarian. And I can see the justification of inviting some in order to encourage them to move along the path towards full freedom. And so I don't have any problem with the notion that not everyone there was a pristine democracy. I do think you can criticize the summit for spending too much time talking about the quote unquote state of democracy in the United States. Now, I believe strongly in the United States acknowledging its deficiencies. But I think there was also a great deal of American domestic politics in that part of the summit, and not necessarily a theme which advances our international interests. And so looking at this, you might say holistically, from both a foreign policy standpoint and a US domestic standpoint, there may have been too much domestic US politics at the summit. And that means it limits our reach globally, at least partly. I don't want to overstate that, but it does. Third point, though, and here I may come closer to Dimitri than you might think. I don't think this was an overwhelmingly successful event. I think it was a net plus, but whether this moved the scales of our geopolitical position, I'm not so sure. I believe, though, that more work along these lines can certainly have a significant positive impact on our geopolitical condition. Again, it's an enormous advantage that, what is it, probably 70% or plus 80, that means not 80%, probably over 70% of world GDP consists of democracies. That's a serious advantage for us as we look at real competition from our adversaries in Beijing and in Moscow.
Melinda?
Thanks, John. And I don't think anyone here is going to claim that the Democracy Summit was an overwhelming success. The US government isn't putting any more money behind it. It looks like it was mostly a rhetorical flourish. Dimitri, question for you. So what does it tell us about the enduring appeal of democracies that two authoritarian regimes are writing op-eds about their democratic credentials and pushing for invitations to the Democracy Summit? Why are Moscow and Beijing so upset? Are they upset that they were excluded, or is there something more there?
I did not hear from any Chinese or Russian officials, whether publicly or privately, that they expected an invitation to the event or that they would pay any price to be included. I think that the big question in Moscow is, what does the summit mean? And if indeed it was just a rhetorical flourish, I think they would be slightly irritated, somewhat critical, but not a big deal. I was on 2 TV programs in Russia during the last 3 weeks with 2 different senior foreign ministry officials. And when I asked one of them that very question, whether from the Russian foreign ministry standpoint, this democracy summit initiative is a real challenge to Russia, that official, who actually happens to be Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Ryabkov, the one who negotiates with the Biden administration on security and strategic issues, he said, oh, come on, that's really not a big deal. It's basically rhetoric. Today, when we discussed the same issue with the foreign ministry spokesman in Moscow, Maria Zakharova, she tended to take it more seriously and was kind of, I shouldn't say, more excited, but thought that this is a part of a dangerous partner. But I feel very strongly that so far, very little damage was done. And if that is where we're going to stop. If we would kind of state loudly and clearly our principles and remind people that these principles matter and that actually believing and following these principles makes nations more successful, if that's what we will do, I certainly would have no issue with something like that. If we, however, would try to create a pro-democratic Comintern, you may remember Comintern in the 30s, Stalin's creation, which was promoting Soviet ideas and Soviet values across the world. That at the time was confronted with major opposition in the West. And the Soviets were told in very uncertain terms, you have to make a decision. Do you want to have normal relations with us or not? And if normal relations with us are a priority, don't challenge our regimes, our systems of government. You may not like them. We are not going even to engage in this debate. This is our sovereign right. And if you believe in democracy in international relations, trying to challenge our right to govern our own affairs is undemocratic. We did not cross this line yet. At least the Biden administration, in my view, did not cross this line yet. So I'm not talking about something that is really irreparable. I'm talking about what I consider dangerous trend, which I hope the Biden administration will be wise enough to keep well under control.
Jacob, let me ask a two-finger to that. Dimitri, why is Biden's policy any different than previous administrations? You said it was different than Trump, but I would say from a broader perspective, Biden's foreign policy looks very similar to if you go back to George W. Bush, to the internationalist tradition. So how is it dangerous? I would argue that it was within keeping within the American foreign policy tradition since the end of World War II.
Well, Trump was not quite following American foreign policy tradition. He was quite different.
He's an aberration. Yeah, but how is Biden new and dangerous? Because he's within the American foreign policy tradition since World War II.
Well, I do not know about any American president who would try to create and to emphasize those great dividing lines in international politics. I am talking about democracy versus autocracy. For instance, Harry Truman, whom I genuinely admire, he of course talked a lot about democracy, but in fact he emphasized something different. He emphasized not democracy, which about how the nations rule themselves. He emphasized freedom, and he defended freedom in countries which clearly were not democratic at the time: Taiwan, South Korea, to say nothing about Saudi Arabia, of course, Portugal, which was made a NATO member, Greek under Black Canals, which was also not quite a democratic nation. But NATO was defending freedom of its members, their right to select their system of government. And the Biden administration is creating an impression that they would do something that many founding fathers considered inappropriate and dangerous, namely going and looking for demons abroad, including demons which are not directly challenging the United States, just because we have a moral urge to pursue and destroy demons. That is, to the extent this becomes an American foreign policy, I would consider really dangerous.
I'd like to follow up there with Ambassador Herbst and ask you, from your perspective, John, do you think the Biden administration is actually doing this, or is the democracy talk more of a smokescreen? For example, the perception among some of the democracy promoters in Washington, as far as I can tell, is that the administration is eager to reach some kind of accommodation with Russia and is in fact not that interested in standing up for democracy when it comes to Eastern Europe or Ukraine. What's your take?
Okay, that's a multifaceted question in this context. And I will try to offer a multifaceted answer. First, let me perhaps surprise Dimitri by saying I am a John Quincy Adams fan too. And the quotation that he gave part of also included Adams saying, "We are the well-wisher of democracy or of liberal values abroad, although the guarantor of none." But it's that first part of it, the well-wisher of democracy abroad, which I point to, because that speaks to what I said earlier, that values have been an important part of our policy from the early days of the American Republic, including among people who are celebrated as quote unquote realists in foreign policy. Now, I agree that Biden's promotion of democracy is fully in line with the traditional American promotion of democracy, meaning it is not just our values, we see it as within our interests, and we do it because it's both in our values and it's in our interests. But he is not an extreme promoter of democracy. Biden clearly understood some of the dangers in our misbegotten policies in Afghanistan. He was on the record, 10 and more years ago about promoting counterterrorism as opposed to nation building in Afghanistan, the SMART recommendation, which unfortunately was not followed. So that speaks to Biden's general approach overall. Now, regarding Biden's Russia policy. This is broader than just a question of values. It's also what I would call a question of interest. I thought when Biden won the election last year that we were going to have a strong policy pushing back against Kremlin geopolitical provocations, stronger and more consistent than under Trump. That has not been quite true. I think the Biden team deserves pretty high marks for its energetic and relatively strong diplomacy, pushing back against the Kremlin military buildup on Ukraine's border in the spring and also this fall. But at the same time, it's pretty clear that whether or not there are two schools of thought in the Biden administration, there may be, there may not be, the notion that we also have to, quote unquote, establish a stable and predictable relationship with Moscow seems to be another guiding principle for Biden. And that conception in a Washington which realizes that, quote unquote, past resets with Moscow were a failure is a way to do a stealth reset. And even as we've seen a fairly strong, and from my standpoint, praiseworthy response to Moscow's aggression, or rather provocations on Ukraine's border, we've also seen a constant readiness to reach out to Moscow saying, hey, we'd really like to be friends with you, even after we lay down strong markers. And while the administration thinks that's nuance, the Kremlin interprets that as weakness. And we've seen major league weakness in our policy responding to Kremlin cyber provocations. Biden laid down a red line in Geneva about cyber provocations, which Moscow crossed with a series of hacks on our July 4 weekend. All that produced was another red line in a phone call from Biden to Putin. That was in mid-November, actually mid-July. And of course, we had, well, Moscow stopped the cyber attacks in July and August. After that, they resumed in September and October, despite the red line, without any serious American response. Instead, we looked rather foolish because we were busily and proudly working on a joint resolution to introduce at the UN on cyber cooperation. And the cherry on the top of this dismal cake was the release of a Russian cyber criminal in October, whom we had spent years trying to get to the United States. We released him to Russia. So Moscow cleaned our clock on cyber. And the administration, too eager for the reset or the stealth reset, went along. So in that sense, I share some of the concerns of the democracy crowd, but I think that there are members of that crowd who to this day don't understand our failed overreach in the Middle East. So I think I've managed with that answer to tick off a whole slew of people, but maybe to the enjoyment of the audience.
I definitely hope so. Melinda?
Okay, I was really curious, Dimitri, if you could say, your last answer was really interesting. And you talked about the demons. Who do you have in mind here when you mentioned the demons with the Biden administration? And maybe you could say more about the way that this event was framed. It's really interesting. So in the event description, it says that, is Washington inadvertently creating a countervailing coalition that is increasingly prepared to challenge US interests around the world? But Russia and China are already they're already challenging US interests abroad. So if the result of the Democracy Summit was to mobilize a countervailing coalition, aren't we in the same place anyway? We saw yesterday, Xi says that he's going to support President Putin when it comes to Ukraine. So really, does the Democracy Summit really matter that much?
Well, let me say first that China so far was very careful not to support a Russian position on Ukraine, certainly did not support Russian position on Donbass, never endorsed the Russian occupation of Crimea. So I think that the Chinese had their policy. That's why I said it's not quite an alliance between China and Russia. But let me say this. What John said, and I have a lot of agreements with John, I hope it would not offend him. And I thought that actually on how to handle the situation in Eastern Ukraine, I thought that John's and my approaches were very close. Because I was also, like John, if I interpreted what John was saying correctly, I was in favor turning Donbass back to Ukrainian sovereignty. I thought that there was a way to do it, which would not allow these provinces have an effective control over Ukrainian foreign policy. And I thought that we were not talking about a situation when Donbass would be nominally Ukrainian, but would be under effective Russian control. And I thought all of this would be doable with a measure of autonomy for Donbass, and very important, with informal guarantees, but firm guarantees to Russia that Ukraine would not become a NATO member, and that NATO infrastructure would not be delivered to Ukraine in any meaningful numbers. And then Zelensky, for reasons which I do not understand, decided to emphasize not so much Donbass, but Crimea, making very clear to the Russians that unless they promise to return Crimea, any concessions on Donbass would be only an invitation for further pressure on Russia. And it was stated that allowing Ukraine to join NATO, at least as a principle, is almost sacred. It's almost a question of both our values and our matcha to tell the Russians that their red lines on this issue should not be taken seriously. But Melinda, wait a second. We are telling the Russians that we are very concerned about their troop movements inside their own territory. And yet we do not accept that the Russians are entitled to be concerned about Ukraine being brought closer and closer to an alliance, which clearly today is an opponent of Russia, which clearly today, as the former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said, is bringing American military infrastructure to the suburbs of St. Petersburg. This is not a morality play. We may be good guys, the Russians may be bad guys, but you know, if you can defeat bad guys, and if you can force them to accept their surrender and to sign an agreement which would provide you control over their behavior, that's fully justifiable in terms of the traditions of international diplomacy. But when you are dealing with a country like Russia, not only with nuclear weapons, but also with at least comparable military power in Eastern Europe, and some analysts believe that they have a preponderant military power, I do not know why it would be in the American interest to, if you wish, enhance Russian threat to their neighbors by contributing to this very hostile environment. And those people in Washington and Brussels who believe in sanctions, more sanctions as a way to contain Russia, think they don't understand the Russian mindset at all. When they are threatened with this round of sanctions and then another round of sanctions, and there is no light at the end of the tunnel, it actually helps Putin to consolidate his majority. And you know what may happen? What may happen that if we have a conflict, military conflict in Ukraine, the way the Russians would behave themselves in this conflict, it would not be a kind of a limited ground operation in Eastern Donbass. It may be much more in the tradition of American warfare, air dominance, missiles destroying Ukrainian, not only military targets, but also civilian infrastructure, roads, communications. And if at the end of this process, which may just take several days, Europe would look at the situation and they would see Russian troops on the border of Poland and Russian missiles pointed at major European cities, you know what? I would not be surprised that in many European capitals, they would not have the guts to continue challenging Russia and would be quite prepared to accept an agreement with Moscow, which would not only surrender Ukraine, but which would also kind of promise Russia that sanctions would no longer be used against them. Are we prepared to accept consequences of major confrontation with Russia? And let me be very clear. If the Russians were threatening the beaches of Florida, or if the Russians were really positioned to invade a NATO country, or if the Russians were prepared to threaten American access to Middle East oil, if we're talking about any of America's fundamental interests, I think we should stand up to the Russians or whomever, no matter what. But the idea that American interests and values require a position we're taking now on Ukraine, I don't find it based on American values. And moreover, I think that this position really ignores what serious statesmen should start with, thinking about consequences of their actions and being prepared to handle unintended implications of what you start. If you start something with another major power, you better be prepared to finish it with victory. Are we?
Dimitri, I'm dying to respond to you in about 10 different ways, but I'm gonna be a good girl and I'm gonna be a moderator and I'm ask Ambassador Herbst to respond. Go ahead, Ambassador Herbst.
Okay, I thought Jake was my question. I'll be happy to answer this. First, there has been a strain of thought regarding US policy towards Russia and Ukraine that Dimitri just expressed, that we don't have critical interest in Ukraine, and we do have critical interest in avoiding a nuclear confrontation, if not actual war, fighting war with Russia. Simply put, I think that concern, while real, is greatly overstated. Russia today is a major power without a doubt, and our only peer nuclear competitor, but it's also, in conventional military terms, much weaker than the Soviet Union. And we were able to manage a crisis in Berlin in the late 1940s with the Berlin airlift, a crisis in Berlin when the Berlin Wall was built in 61, and a crisis in Cuba in 62, when the Soviet Union was a greater danger to the United States than Russia is today. So we were able to handle this. And I don't have any doubt that we could handle any crisis along the lines that Dimitri just outlined today. It's less difficult, it's easier, it's less dangerous to us than those three crises were in the past. That to me is, but Dimitri, let me finish, then you feel free to.
Of course, I did not know that you were continuing. I apologize.
Good.
There was a point.
Okay. Second, what are our interests in Ukraine? Now, the first major interest is this is the largest country wholly in Europe, with a largest population, with serious talent in the cyber realm, in the military realm, military transport. And a Ukraine aligned with the West means a stronger West. A Ukraine aligned with Russia, to use Brzezinski's concept, it could mean a return to a Russian empire, which at a minimum is a potential problem to us and maybe more. But then it goes beyond this. Putin has a revisionist agenda. There's no doubt about it. He wants to change the rules of the international order, or there'll be new rules, as one of the Valdai conferences had as its motto. And part of that upending of the international order means weakening, if not help trying to dissolve the bonds of NATO, of the EU. And even as Moscow conducts its war in Donbass, and now is via intimidation trying to achieve more in Ukraine, they continue to provoke our NATO allies, especially in the Baltic states, to a lesser extent, Poland and Romania and Bulgaria. The very day that NATO was meeting at Wales in September of 2014, Moscow kidnapped an Estonian counterintelligence officer from Estonia, just a day or two after Obama was in Tallinn trying to reassure the Estonians. The way to best protect our Eastern NATO allies is to make sure that Moscow does not achieve its ends in Donbass. That is the smart geopolitical move, and that's one that we are pursuing. Last point. I have no doubt that if Moscow chooses to invade Ukraine with its conventional forces, using all elements of national power, its Air Force and its Navy too, they can probably seize any objective in Ukraine. I also don't have a doubt that that will be bloody. There'll be Russian casualties, which will not be so easy for Putin to explain, and that an occupation of Ukraine will prove to be a bloody affair, which will raise problems for Moscow, for the Russian leadership. And I believe that there are many smart and influential people in Moscow who understand that. I think sanctions, in fact, have had a major impact on Russia's economy. The sanctions that Biden is threatening now will do even more damage. And that Putin has learned that he gets political advantage by threatening. And he's been leery to do things which lead to a major strike back. He was surprised by the sanctions in Donbass in the summer of 2014. And maybe Moscow would have been less likely to use Bukes if they had understood what was coming, because that certainly had an impact on Europe's willingness to go along with major sanctions. And I think what we're looking at right now is a prolonged Russian intimidation campaign. They could go into Ukraine large, but I don't think they will, because Putin's already gotten some small advantage from his buildup on Ukraine's border. And that's because of the over-eagerness of the Biden administration to park the relationship with Moscow.
Dimitri,
over to you.
Well, John, again, you mentioned several different things, talking about those positions which the United States need to defend in Europe. Some of them, in my view, are absolutely clear and absolutely right. Now, if you're talking about Russian invasion of a NATO country, I don't think there's any difference between you and me. That would challenge American fundamental interests, that would undermine the international system, which based to a large extent on the notion that if you attack American allies, there are unacceptable consequences. And we're not debating how the United States should protect NATO allies. We're talking about countries which are outside NATO. We're talking in the case of Ukraine about a country which is really corrupt, which has a very deceitful foreign policy. And you know this, and Melinda knows this better than I do, because you are more familiar with Ukraine. But we can give a lot of examples of the things the Ukrainians are doing, which are quite similar, and in some cases perhaps worse, the things that the Russians are doing. So let's not turn this European rivalry, a kind of rivalry which President Washington, in his farewell address, advised the United States to stay from. Let's not turn this into a morality play and into a vital American interest. And let me say this. I am fully prepared, as I said, to do a lot of things, and would recommend for the United States to do a lot of things to defend American interests and American commitments. But in this case, you are talking about American revisionist foreign policy and unannounced, and sometimes actually even announced American intent to tell the Russians that they cannot do things even within their own borders, which they consider essential to their security, totally rejecting their arguments, totally rejecting their narrative. and taking a kind of absolute position about our might being always right. That is first not right, and second, it creates a backlash which this country does not need.
I'd like to turn to one of the questions from our audience that is a broad question that builds off of this. It's from Graham Allison from Harvard University. He asks, assessed in terms of operational consequences, which relationship is more impactful? The alignment of China and Russia, or the alliance between Germany and the US? And by that, I assume Graham means Europe itself. John, why don't you first tackle that?
Okay. I think there's a major difference between the alignment, which is a good word, of Russia and China at the moment, but not the alignment of the US and Germany or the US and Europe. The alliance of that we have, the transatlantic alliance, which is NATO, and also substantial cooperation, which dwarfs Russia-Chinese cooperation between the US and the EU. And again, this is one of our great strengths. And that's an alliance built first on values, but also on geopolitical interests. Now, there are many nuances here which we can explore, but I think to answer this question, that's enough for right now. As for China and Russia, they certainly have, or rather the leadership in both countries, certainly have a great interest in working together against the American position still of dominance internationally, albeit of diminishing dominance. And that is the driver in the cooperation we see. But it's a driver which has serious limitations. So Putin has hoped ever since the war with Ukraine began in 2014 that China would step in and provide some of the economic services that the West was no longer willing to provide because of sanctions. And they found that China was not interested. Russia has also been more eager than China, though China's interested too, at hyping Russian-Chinese cooperation vis-a-vis the West. An important fact, which has not been noted by many, is that China showed up at Moscow's signature Western military operation, Zapad, this summer, but only as observers, not as participants. Also demonstrates the limits of what China is willing to do. And finally, and this is my own personal hobby horse, which not everyone shares, but all geopoliticians, georealists should understand this. China and Russia, as great powers that share our border, are naturally competitors at a minimum, or foes. And that's been true in much of their history. And even today, when Xi has an interest of this relationship with Putin to deal with Washington, the Chinese do not hide their irredentist tendencies vis-a-vis Russia. A third secretary at the Chinese-Pakistan embassy in Islamabad claimed earlier this, it was last year, excuse me, that Vladivostok is a Chinese city. Chinese journalists and historians talk about this too. The Russians understand that this is a message for them, what they can expect once China no longer needs Russia vis-a-vis the United States, which is why I think that there will come a day, probably in my lifetime, when there'll be an alignment of Moscow and Washington vis-a-vis Beijing. But that only comes when we make sure we stop Kremlin revisionism, starting in Ukraine.
Jacob, let me jump in here for a minute. Dr.
Well, let's let Dimitri respond to that first.
John said a lot of things I agree with. And again, as always, it's a question of balance, prudent judgment, and knowing when to fight and when to stop. Let me give you an example from everyday life. You walk somewhere in downtown DC, and you see a group of men trying to rape a woman, or you see a group of people trying to rob somebody, or they are beating somebody up, and you see it with your own eyes. I think if there is any possibility for you to do something about the situation, you should do it, even if you have to take very considerable personal risk. You have seen it, you know what is going on, there is clearly right and wrong, and you are a real witness to that, and it really affects you. Now, then you can imagine that somewhere in a very different part of the United States, there is something going on that you have seen on CNN, and there is some confrontation, which looks very ugly, and there is a commentary which makes you exercised. Well, you know, you may want to go and volunteer and go and punish the evildoers. Or you may say that this is very far away from you, that you know very little about that, that visual images which start at a certain moment and end at a certain moment and do not very often provide you the context, that this is not the best way to decide whether to take a risky action. I belong to a school of thought that there is a difference between things that directly affect you and you know a lot about, and things which are far away and you don't understand them very well, and sometimes don't understand them at all. And in terms of Ukraine, I'm with John. It's against American interests to allow Ukraine to become again a part of the Russian Empire. And Brzezinski talked very eloquently about that. But John, you know, I'm sure as well as I do, that at the end of his days, Zbigniew Brzezinski on several occasions have warned that bring Ukraine into NATO is a bridge too far, because while Russia with Ukraine has the potential of recreating the empire, if Russia would have a perception that Ukraine is joining a hostile alliance, Russia very well may view it as being against their existential interests, and Russian response may be fierce.
Melinda?
Yeah, this question was about Russia and China, and I think it's worth pointing out that Dr. Harley Balzer is a great expert on this question. He's in our panel, and we would love to have, he's just written a really brilliant paper on this. It's a really rich conversation, and we'd like to invite everyone to join us next week, Tuesday at 11 a.m. He's going to present his paper. So I'll drop an invitation into the chat. Let me move on to the next question from Mark Katz. He has a question for John. He says, how do you respond to the argument that the US should seek good relations with Russia because Washington needs Moscow to help it with the Iranian nuclear deal? John?
Okay. The Iranian nuclear deal, I believe, is in American interest. And while I think Obama's foreign policy overall was not very strong, I think this was one of the bright spots. I think that Moscow, well, actually, it's an interesting question. You can make an argument that Moscow shares our interest in that deal coming into fruition, so it would uncomplicate its relations with Iran. You'd also make the argument that Moscow has no interest in this deal because they want to make sure that Iran and the US remain at loggerheads. Bottom line, while the Iranian nuclear deal is very important, it's not as important as making sure that Moscow does not upend the international order by imposing its will on Ukraine. And we need to stop that. We can work with Moscow vis-a-vis Iran, and I am all in favor of a dialogue with Moscow where our interests truly overlap, even in the current circumstances. But we don't permit Kremlin aggression in Ukraine, which could then pose a problem for our NATO allies in the East, in order to work with Moscow on the Iranian nuclear issue. By the way, this is not part of your question, but again, just so I can tick off yet another faction of American foreign policy thinking. I think that Moscow's overall policy in Syria has its flaws, but it was better than American overall policy because it was based upon a factor that had a real base of power, meaning Assad. Whereas we assumed that there was a real opposition to Assad that was not jihadi. And with the exceptions of the Kurds, who have a limited ability to project power, that was simply wrong.
Is Dimitri going to respond to this question?
Well, I can, but I also can endorse what John has just said. That's what I'm going to do in this particular instance. I agree with what John said about the Iranian nuclear issue and how to handle it.
Well, I think Melinda was going to ask the final question for this session.
Okay, let's add, Dov Zakheim, one of the board members, has a great question. He says, John notes that the summit invited partial democracies to encourage them to move in the direction of increasing democratic norms. Yet among the invitees were some nasties, Angola, Iraq, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and these are all not free on the Freedom House scale or at exactly the same level as Russia. So he wants to know, how serious was the summit? And he has a second question. I might add that with Biden and Harris discussing in their speeches, why should Washington not expect criticism about its own issues? I think the second part is pointed to John. He was criticizing that piece. Dimitri, do you want to go first, and then John can follow up?
Well, you know, I already said what I think about having to include countries which are really not stellar democracies or even worse than that. And there is a pressure, if you take this approach, dividing the world into two camps, there is a pressure on you to invite those who are prepared to accommodate you or even to work in lockstep with foreign policy with you. And if you kind of deprive them of an invitation, you are pushing them closer to Russia. It's a real dilemma. That's one reason I personally think that we have to be very careful not to create artificial, unnecessary dividing lines. Dov, I remember vividly how we were together in Moscow in 2017, and we were meeting at the Russian Council of Federation, the upper chamber of the Russian legislature. And you, as the one who have started our presentation by telling our Russian hosts very forcefully that Russian interference in American relations is not only unacceptable, but will not be tolerated by the American body politic. I think that you have shaken, actually, our Russian hosts so strong you were, and you were supported by every member of our delegation. That was the right thing to do, and that is the right way to explain to the Russians that America has its own democracy, its own system of government, and we would not allow the Russians to ignore our red lines. It's a different thing, as it seems to me some in the Biden administration are suggesting. It's a different thing to come to other nations, and particularly to other great powers, and tell them that their system of government is totally unacceptable, that it should be improved, and that we take upon ourselves to tell them how they should correct their imperfections. These are two different approaches, and we should understand the difference, and to be careful not to allow our belief and enthusiasm for democracy to leave us to build waters in famous saying that there is no such thing as extremism in defense of liberty. No, zealotry in the pursuit of anything is not really effective foreign policy.
John, the last part of that question was so Dov wanted to know, why shouldn't we expect criticism of American democracy? What's wrong with that?
I don't have a problem with criticism of American democracy. We do have our flaws. And I think it's part of any sober adult foreign policy. Acknowledging one's flaws is a good thing to do. But I already commented that I thought there was some American domestic politicking going on at that summit, which I don't think was helpful. And I would also point out that I think the administration finds it much easier to apologize for America's historical mistakes as opposed to its own.
Well, with that, I think we wrap up our session. Melinda, do you have a final comment you'd like to make?
Happy holidays, and thank you for the opportunity to do this together. We very much enjoy working with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.